Leonard Price thought he had orchestrated the perfect murder. Eleanor Price, his 67-year-old wife, was supposed to die quietly in her sleep, leaving behind back 1.7 million and no questions. But what Leonard didn't know was that Eleanor had already figured him out days before her death. With a hidden journal, secret letters, and one final act of defiance, she laid the trap that would expose him. By the time her heart stopped, the noose around his neck had already begun to tighten. Leonard Price had lived in the same quiet Vermont neighborhood for over 30 years. To his neighbors, he was just another aging retiree with a quiet demeanor and a steady hand. He rarely drew attention to himself, kept his lawn immaculate, and waved politely when spoken to. At 71, Leonard had the outward appearance of someone who had lived a full, uneventful life. But behind the walls of his modest two-story home, he was harboring a growing resentment, a silent hatred that had festered for years. His wife, Eleanor Price, was 67, graceful and intelligent. She had once been a respected professor of art history and had inherited a sizable fortune from her late father, including a $1.7 million life insurance policy. That wealth was Eleanor's alone. The marriage, once full of mutual admiration and shared goals, had gradually turned cold. Leonard had tried, early on, to start businesses, none of which succeeded. He lost money in poor investments and developed an online gambling habit that ate through what little savings they had together. Eleanor didn't interfere in his pursuits, but she never bailed him out either. The money remained hers, protected by legal documents he never had access to. By the time Leonard turned 70, he'd stopped trying to dig himself out of the hole. The solution, in his eyes, became simpler: eliminate Eleanor, inherit her money, and start fresh. He began researching, not the kind of clumsy, impulsive research that could be traced, but subtle, anonymous reading on substances that mimicked natural illness. He studied poisoning, slow, undetectable poisoning. He purchased small quantities of a substance online, under a fake name, and had it shipped to a friend's vacant cabin an hour away. He brought it home in an old toolbox and stored it behind the water heater in the basement. In January, Eleanor started having dizzy spells. It began so gradually that even she didn't see the pattern. A faint headache here, a night of nausea there. Leonard showed concern, gently suggesting she avoid visiting the doctor so often, claiming it was just stress or poor diet. He started preparing all her meals. He made her tea every night, always from the same antique teapot she loved. What she never noticed was that he always poured her cup from the bottom of the pot, where the heavier particles settled. By February, Eleanor's symptoms had worsened. She was losing her balance, sometimes slurring her words. Leonard continued to play the caring husband. He massaged her feet, read to her, and called her his angel when she could barely make it up the stairs. Their friends remarked how lucky Eleanor was to have such a devoted husband. But Eleanor, once sharp and observant, had started writing things down. Short notes about how she felt, what she ate, what she drank. She suspected something wasn't right. At first, she thought it was her mind. But then she started noticing strange things. The food tasted off. Her tea sometimes had a bitter aftertaste. And one day, she found a powdery residue at the bottom of her cup. She didn't confront Leonard. Instead, she called her lawyer and asked to make a few changes to her will. She also asked him how to contact her insurance company privately. That week, she sent a sealed envelope with instructions to her attorney. If anything happened to her, especially something sudden, he was to contact the insurance company and law enforcement. She didn't spell out her suspicions, but she left just enough clues. On April 12th, Leonard made her a final cup of tea. She drank it before bed, quietly, while he sat reading across the room. That night, she died in her sleep. Leonard called 911 in the early morning, his voice shaking with panic. When paramedics arrived, he clutched her hand, tears streaming down his face. The autopsy was inconclusive. At her age, with those symptoms, cardiac arrest seemed likely. No one raised questions. Leonard arranged a simple memorial, accepted sympathy cards, and told friends that he didn't know how he would go on without her. A week later, he filed for the $1.7 million payout. He handed over her death certificate and insurance documents. Everything appeared in order until a red flag appeared. The insurer had received a letter postmarked 10 days before Eleanor's death. It warned them to investigate any sudden death and mention the policy by name. The claim was frozen immediately. Leonard was baffled. No one knew his plan. He had been so careful, but someone, somehow, had seen it coming. As he waited for the money, investigators quietly reopened Eleanor's case, and Leonard Price had no idea that the walls were about to close in. When the insurance company flagged the claim, Leonard Price received a polite but vague notice stating that the payout was under review due to standard procedural concerns. He wasn't alarmed at first. He figured it was routine. Bureaucracy, red tape, nothing to worry about. But weeks passed, and no check arrived. Then came the phone call from a state investigator requesting a short interview, just to verify a few things, they said. That's when the anxiety began creeping in. Leonard hadn't expected any scrutiny. Eleanor's health had been visibly declining. The death appeared natural, and the medical report hadn't indicated foul play. Still, he couldn't ignore the shift in tone. Something was off. He cleaned the house thoroughly before the investigator arrived. He scrubbed the floors, washed the curtains, even threw out the teapot. Just in case. The investigator, Detective Marla Griggs, was polite, almost friendly. She asked routine questions: how Eleanor had been feeling, what their final days together were like, who was managing the estate. Leonard answered calmly, rehearsed in his grief. But Marla had already read Eleanor's file, and something about it didn't sit right. Eleanor had no major history of heart problems, no recent diagnoses, and yet her symptoms had escalated quickly in just a few weeks. Combined with the anonymous letter the insurance company received, there was now enough reason to dig deeper. Marla requested permission to access Eleanor's medical history and samples from the autopsy. Leonard agreed, but he felt a cold sweat form under his collar. He hadn't counted on this. The medical examiner who'd performed the original autopsy had noted Eleanor's symptoms but hadn't tested for toxins. There was no reason to. Now, under Marla's guidance, the samples were reanalyzed, this time looking specifically for poisoning agents. The results came back in 2 weeks, and they were damning. Traces of thallium were found in her liver and kidneys, a toxic metal often used in rodenticides and well known in forensic circles as a poison of choice for slow, undetectable murder. Leonard had used it in small doses, confident that it would pass his illness. But now, with this discovery, the state medical board reclassified Eleanor's death as a homicide. Leonard wasn't arrested immediately. Marla wanted to build the case carefully. She began retracing Leonard's steps over the past year, searching for purchases, suspicious internet activity, and unusual behavior. She obtained a warrant to search the house. In the basement, behind the water heater, she found the old metal toolbox. Inside were empty vials, latex gloves, and a single box of thallium-laced powder labeled as pest control. Leonard, in the meantime, sensed the change. Neighbors weren't stopping by anymore. His phone calls to the insurance company went unanswered. And then one day, 2 plainclothes officers arrived at his door with a search warrant. They photographed everything, collected items, and boxed up the teapot, cups, and any medicine bottles in the house. Leonard tried to stay calm, but his world was unraveling. But what shook him the most came days later. His attorney received a letter, handwritten and postmarked before Eleanor's death. It had been sent by Eleanor herself and addressed to both her lawyer and her sister. In it, she detailed her suspicions. She wrote about how her symptoms started only after Leonard began making all her food. She described the strange taste in her tea. She even mentioned where she had hidden a few samples of the liquid from her teacup, tucked away in a sealed jar in the back of the freezer. Samples she instructed her lawyer to preserve if anything happened to her. The jar was found during the search. Tests confirmed the presence of thallium in high concentration. It was the smoking gun, undeniable proof that Eleanor had been poisoned. But more than that, it revealed that she had known. She had known Leonard was killing her. And instead of confronting him, she outmaneuvered him. She had left a trail that investigators could follow, a quiet act of courage that would ultimately bring him down. As Marla reviewed the timeline, she realized Eleanor had been several steps ahead. The anonymous tip to the insurance company? Sent from a local library. Security footage showed a frail woman mailing it herself. Eleanor had staged her own posthumous defense, ensuring that if Leonard got what he wanted, it would only be temporary. Leonard Price had believed he was clever, but Eleanor, even in her final days, had played the long game. And now, the full truth was beginning to surface. The arrest came early one morning. Leonard Price had just stepped outside to collect the newspaper when two unmarked cars pulled up to the curb. Plainclothes detectives stepped out, followed by uniformed officers. Leonard didn't run. He didn't resist. As they cuffed him and read him his rights, he stared blankly at the damp grass beneath his feet, his mind already scrambling for a version of the truth that could save him. He was charged with first-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and insurance fraud. His neighbors watched from their windows in disbelief, whispering behind curtains, stunned by the unraveling of the man they had trusted for decades. Inside the police station, Leonard was silent for hours. He asked for a lawyer, and when one arrived, he refused to speak. But the evidence was already overwhelming. The toxicology reports, the preserved teacup samples, the handwritten letter from Eleanor, the security footage from the library. Each piece tightened the noose. Prosecutors were confident they had a solid case, but they still wanted to understand Leonard's full motive. What made a man spend years beside someone only to destroy her for money? Investigators pieced together a financial timeline. Leonard had been quietly drowning in debt. Credit card statements showed large, frequent payments to offshore betting websites. Several of his accounts were overdrawn, and he had taken out personal loans under false pretenses. The $1.7 million life insurance policy had become his only escape route. It was clear now, Eleanor hadn't just been a target of convenience. She had been a calculated, long-term solution to his crumbling world. Meanwhile, the media caught wind of the case. News outlets were quick to latch onto the story of a quiet, elderly couple torn apart by greed and betrayal. Headlines called Eleanor the wife who outsmarted her killer. They published excerpts from her letter, praising her presence of mind in her final days. Public sympathy poured in, not just for her death, but for the quiet, strategic way she had fought back without ever raising her voice. She had died knowing the man she loved was trying to end her, but she refused to let him win. The prosecution built a timeline that was airtight. Leonard had started ordering suspicious materials 9 months before Eleanor's death. Surveillance footage from hardware stores and small chemical suppliers showed him purchasing gloves, containers, and pest control powders. One store clerk remembered him specifically because he had asked unusually specific questions about safety and dosage. Leonard's internet history, recovered from an old laptop, was even more revealing. Searches included phrases like how much poison to kill slowly, does thallium show up in autopsy, and delayed symptoms of metal poisoning. But one of the most compelling pieces of evidence came from an unlikely source, Eleanor's private journal. After her death, her sister found it tucked beneath a false drawer in Eleanor's old vanity. In it, Eleanor had detailed her physical symptoms day by day, including what she ate and drank and how she felt afterward. More chillingly, she had included pages speculating about Leonard's motives. She wrote that he had become more controlling and distant, and that he always insisted on making her tea despite her protests. The journal painted a picture of a woman who had begun to feel her life slipping away and yet chose not to panic, but to plan. The defense struggled to build a narrative. They claimed that Leonard had been under emotional strain, that he had been desperate and mentally unstable. They tried to suggest that Eleanor had grown paranoid and misinterpreted his attempts at caregiving. But the facts were too strong. The jury would see not just a man who had killed, but a man who had stalked his victim under the same roof for months, watching her weaken night after night. What made the case even more tragic was that Eleanor had once tried to save her marriage. Investigators found letters in her desk drawer addressed to Leonard, never sent. In them, she expressed concern about their growing distance, about his financial troubles, and her willingness to help if he would just talk to her. It was a haunting reminder that the woman Leonard had murdered wasn't just a source of money. She had once loved him enough to forgive. A.S. Leonard sat in his cell awaiting trial. The silence became unbearable. His plan, once so methodical, had collapsed completely. Eleanor had seen what was coming, and by quietly leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs, she had ensured that the truth would rise. Long after her heart stopped beating, the trial began 6 months after Leonard's arrest. The courtroom was packed, not just with press and legal teams, but with people who had once lived peacefully alongside the couple. Former neighbors, colleagues of Eleanor's, old students, and curious onlookers filled the benches each day, drawn by the slow, chilling spectacle of a man accused of poisoning his wife over money. The prosecution opened with a powerful image: a devoted wife, systematically poisoned over weeks by the very man she trusted most. They called it a betrayal of the highest kind, one so calculated it bordered on cruelty. Evidence was presented methodically. First came the toxicology report, clinical, precise, and impossible to dispute. It proved the presence of thallium in Eleanor's organs in levels consistent with repeated, low-dose exposure. Then came the teacup samples found in the freezer. Their contents matched the toxin found in her system. Next were the online purchases, with timestamps and delivery records that pointed squarely to Leonard. Each step of his plan had left behind digital footprints. But the prosecution didn't rely only on science. They leaned heavily on Eleanor's handwritten notes, her journal entries, and the letter she had mailed to her lawyer. They painted a picture of a woman who knew she was dying, and more heartbreakingly, knew who was responsible. The jury listened silently as excerpts were read aloud. One entry, written just days before her death, detailed how she had watched Leonard stir her tea, how she had faked drinking it one night and poured it into a mason jar instead. That jar had become one of the key pieces of physical evidence. She had not screamed. She had not run. Instead, she had chosen to outwit her killer. The defense did what it could. Leonard's lawyer argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the presence of thallium could have come from external sources. They claimed Eleanor had a known interest in herbal remedies and may have ingested something toxic by accident. They tried to discredit her journal, suggesting it was written under the influence of deteriorating mental health. But the strategy fell flat. The jury didn't see a delusional woman. They saw someone quietly documenting a pattern, preparing for what she feared was inevitable. Witnesses were called. Eleanor's sister testified about a late-night phone call in which Eleanor had hinted that she no longer felt safe. A former co-worker shared how Eleanor had once confided that she thought Leonard was hiding something but didn't want to sound paranoid. Then came a former pharmacist who testified that Eleanor had never filled any prescriptions that would explain her symptoms. There were no gaps in the medical records. Nothing supported the defense's theory. One of the more disturbing revelations came from Leonard's financial records. Just 2 weeks before Eleanor's death, he had contacted a real estate agent about purchasing a condo in Florida, paid in full, cash. The down payment was suspiciously timed, and when questioned, Leonard claimed he had been considering retirement. But the jury saw it for what it was, a plan already in motion for life after Eleanor. As the trial wore on, Leonard's appearance began to shift. The confident, tidy man who had been arrested months before now sat hunched and worn, avoiding eye contact, his expression fixed in a permanent scowl. He never took the stand. His lawyer advised against it, knowing that cross-examination would expose the holes in his story. The prosecution didn't need a confession. The evidence spoke louder than anything Leonard could say. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Leonard showed no emotion as it was read aloud. No tears, no pleas, no apology. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When asked if he had any final statement, he declined. The courtroom was silent as Eleanor's sister stood to speak. She didn't raise her voice. She simply thanked the jury and the prosecutors. Then she held up Eleanor's journal, wrapped in a blue ribbon, and said, "She saved herself. The only way she could. And now everyone knows who she really was. Not a victim, but a fighter." Outside the courthouse, reporters called Eleanor a hero. Her story spread across the country, shared on television specials, podcasts, and articles. The woman who had once lived quietly was now remembered not just for how she died, but for how she refused to die without being heard. Leonard Price faded into the background, his name tied forever to a failed plan, a greedy betrayal, and a woman who had the last word from beyond the grave. In the months following the verdict, the legacy of Eleanor Price grew in ways no one had expected. What had begun as a local tragedy in a quiet Vermont town had transformed into a national story of quiet resilience and calculated justice. News segments focused on her bravery, true crime podcasts dissected her final moves, and articles praised her for the extraordinary calm with which she faced her death. She was no longer just another name on a death certificate. She had become a symbol of defiance, a reminder that even in her weakest moments, she had taken steps to ensure the truth would be known. Eleanor's sister, Grace, became the unofficial spokesperson for her memory. She gave interviews, participated in panels about domestic abuse and elder betrayal, and worked closely with advocacy groups to raise awareness about covert spousal crimes. What many people didn't realize was how common slow, undetected poisonings could be, especially in marriages where one partner held power over the other in moments of illness. Grace used Eleanor's story to push for new legislation requiring mandatory toxicology testing in unexplained elder deaths. A bill inspired by the case, known as Eleanor's Law, was introduced in several states to strengthen oversight in life insurance claims when sudden death was involved. Her death wasn't just mourned, it led to change. Meanwhile, Leonard Price sat alone in his cell at the state penitentiary. He was isolated, not only because of his age, but because even among fellow inmates, his crime carried a particular weight. Poisoning one's spouse was seen as cowardly, a betrayal too quiet to earn any twisted respect. Other prisoners avoided him. He spent most of his time reading, pacing, or staring out the narrow window in his cell. He received no visitors, no letters, no calls. The money he had once dreamed of never came. His accounts were frozen, his debts exposed. What little remained of his assets was tied up in court-ordered restitution and legal fees. Occasionally, he was sent articles that mentioned him. Once, a guard had dropped a copy of a national magazine onto his bunk, open to a feature titled "The Woman Who Solved Her Own Murder." His name was there, described coldly, almost clinically. He wasn't painted as a mastermind or even a villain, just a desperate man who failed. That was the worst of it for Leonard. The failure. Not just the plan, but the legacy. In the end, the world had sided with Eleanor. She had become unforgettable, and he had become irrelevant. Back in Vermont, Eleanor's former students held a small memorial at the university where she once taught. They spoke about her brilliance, her passion for art, and how she had never boasted about her wealth or influence. One of her students placed a framed copy of one of her last journal entries beside her photo beneath a banner that read, "Truth, even in silence." It was simple, but it resonated deeply. Everyone who attended left knowing that her quiet strength had done what no confrontation ever could. It had dismantled a killer's plan without raising a voice or sounding an alarm. Years later, a documentary aired on national television about the case. It traced Leonard's downward spiral, Eleanor's suspicions, and the meticulous way she documented everything. Viewers were stunned by her clarity in the face of betrayal, especially in her final days. The documentary ended not with her death, but with her letter, the one she wrote to her lawyer. A narrator read her words over a soft piano track. "If I am gone, let it be known I did not go quietly. Let it be known I saw the truth and did not look away." That letter reached millions. It became a viral quote online, shared by women who saw in Eleanor's words not only courage, but wisdom. She had refused to be erased. Even in death, she had left behind her voice, her reasoning, and a trail of undeniable evidence. The house where she and Leonard had lived was eventually sold, gutted, and remodeled. No one spoke of it much anymore in town, though some people still passed by and paused, remembering the woman who had once lived there. But her legacy didn't need a house to survive. It lived in laws changed, in conversations sparked, and in the simple, haunting fact that a woman had solved her own murder before it even happened. Leonard Price died alone in prison 6 years into his sentence. No obituary, no funeral, just a name on a list. His story ended the moment Eleanor's began to echo. Her final act had outlived him, outsmarted him, and ensured that the world would remember her, not as a victim, but as the quiet architect of justice.